I feel like this is really a privilege to be with you all today and to discuss accommodations in the workplace, among other things. We'll touch on a lot of different stuff. I have been an HR professional for over 25 years, and I am in the process of actually kind of changing my career around a little bit. I started a consulting firm doing HR work, but I'm really interested in accessible design and universal design, and I've gone back to school studying interior design. So I'm kind of trying to incorporate all of that in. So that's just a little bit about me. I've worked in high tech, nonprofit, higher education, retail, and so we're going to kind of touch on a lot of those different things today, and I'll take you through what we're going to cover. And it is really warm up here, and I've been cold, so this is good. So I'm going to move a little bit since this is very large, so you can see my slide. So I'm going to touch on some of my experiences with disability and accommodation. Obviously, I have a visible disability, a physical disability, and I too consider myself very privileged. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's really great to be able to talk about this with all of you. And then accommodations, so facts and myths. There are a lot of knowledgeable people here, so I think you probably know a lot more about the myths and know that what the real facts are, but maybe some of you don't. So we'll talk some about that. And then some of the goals of reasonable accommodation, the resources available, and then we'll have a group exercise and some closing thoughts, and try to spend most of the time on the group exercise. So anyway, I'm going to move along. So I'm going to start with childhood, and I'm not going to go into a big, long explanation, but I want you to know where I come from the perspective of disability, and I can relate with a lot of things that were shared today. You know, around the medical model and all the different models that are out there. I grew up I was born in the mid-'60s, so I'm dating myself, and it was before a lot of laws were passed. So this is me at the age of 3. I would have made a very good poster child for the Jerry Lewis Telethon with that picture, I think. I was born with cerebral palsy, and my dad's name incidentally was Jerry, so it would have been perfect. Cerebral palsy is brain damage to the motor area of the brain that affects people very differently. So I have what I consider to be a very mild form, even though I'm limited in my ability to walk, and maybe some other things. I don't have a cognitive issue with my disability. I can hear okay, I can see okay, but it can affect any of your senses. So you can see people with disabilities who literally cannot communicate or really function very well. That is not me, but that is what I have. And accommodations were a part of my life from the get-go. Obviously, you know, I used crutches when I was really little. This is me in 2nd grade. This is when I got mainstreamed into regular public school. So I went to special school. When I was 3, I was in a special school. When I was 7, I went to regular school. I didn't need really any accommodations except longer time to get from class to class because I walked really slow. So that was my main accommodation. And then this is me when I was in 4th grade. I had a lot of surgeries as a kid, and that was when I had hip surgery. I had a body cast for about 6 weeks, and I was homeschooled, and then I went to back to the special school I went to when I was really little, so that they could, you know, keep me on pace with everything. And I was glad to have the opportunity to be able to go, you know, back to that school to keep my education up. So that just gives you a sense of some of the accommodations, even as a kid, that were made for me. So those were very defining in terms of how I think about things, and even I relate to some of that still today. This is me in college. So I grew up on the East Coast, and I chose to go to school at the University of Arizona. At that time, and probably still is the case, it was one of the top 5 schools in the world for accessibility. And, you know, back in the 80s, there wasn't as much talk about learning disabilities or invisible disabilities or anything like that, but there was a learning disabilities program at the University of Arizona, so they were very progressive. They had I know somebody here earlier talked about sports. They have a really amazing adaptive sports program. And I did not take advantage of any of academic accommodations, but I did take advantage of a lot of the physical accommodations. So they had special special things that I could go to for, you know, strengthening my muscles or anything like that. And I took advantage of all of that while I was there. Physical therapy was a big part of my life, and I am an individual sports person, and I swim. I still swim today. That's one of my main things, and it keeps me sane. Anybody that's worked with me and knows I swim, they know it keeps me sane. It's a good thing. I can get irritable without swimming. I need that. This person down, these are my parents. And I was born to the perfect parents. My dad was an architect, and my mom was an early childhood education major. I was diagnosed with my disability at the age of 2, and my mom knew that there was something that was just not right because I couldn't walk. And so thank goodness she had that background. This gentleman in the back standing behind me is probably my best mentor. This was in college. He hired me at the University of Arizona to be a resume critiquer. One of my biggest concerns in life is really about people with disabilities having equal access to employment opportunities. And I was very scared as a college student about being able to have those opportunities for myself. This was before the ADA was passed. I didn't see people like myself in the workplace, and I was worried about, you know, am I going to be able to get a job? I mean, I'm smart, but so what? That doesn't mean anything. There's a lot of stigma out there about disability. So this person hired me, and we just talked the other day, as a matter of fact, and he really steered me in the direction of human resources. And that's really where I started started thinking about human resources as a career, was because of Ron Hummel. He also was instrumental in helping me find my first job. So my first job out of college was in retail. I worked for what was then the Broadway department store. Some of you who are older may know of the Broadway. They were acquired by other companies many, many moons ago, and they are no longer. But they had a program for people that wanted to go into HR, but you had to be a sales associate to start. And so you had to go through, you know, probably at least a year rotation of sales associate work. And physically at that time, I walked around a lot more then. And so that was just out of the realm for me. And they really took a risk. And they started working with me on getting into an HR role from the get-go, which is like literally in 1990, before the ADA was passed. That kind of thing was really unheard of. So I was very fortunate to have had that opportunity. Unfortunately, I didn't love the job, but I was very fortunate to have the opportunity. So that's a little bit about my college and kind of where I landed. And then I want to talk more about my career experiences since then. So after I worked in retail, I went to work in higher education, and I went back to the University of Arizona, and I worked on a grant-funded project that worked with people with disabilities to help them find employment opportunities. So I was working with employers on helping accommodate people with disabilities to work for them. So accommodations became not something that I was focused on for myself, but I was focused on helping people with disabilities in school find accommodations that would allow them to work in the workplace. So that was my first experience. And if you've ever worked on a college campus, and probably a lot of you have been to school, or maybe all of you have, it's a very open environment, and disability is something that's a lot more prevalent, especially where I went to school, because it was one of the top 5 schools in the world for people with disabilities, because it's an accessible campus. You're kind of in a bubble a little bit. So it's not necessarily realistic about what you're going to find when you go into a more corporate environment, and that was true for me. But while I was there, I loved being there, and I really felt like I got to make a difference. And this was probably 1994 to 99, when the people were still really trying to figure out, well, what is this ADA thing, and what do you do with it? And then I went to work in high tech, which I stayed there for about 13 years. That's where I met Cindy. And I worked in talent acquisition, and I was instrumental in doing a lot of hiring for call centers across the country for Intuit. And what was really great about that was it was the place where I learned probably the most personally and professionally about myself from a disability standpoint, as well as some other ways. I traveled a lot in this job, and I will tell you a little bit more about what travel is like for me in a minute, but that was eye-opening in terms of how I spend my time and things like that. One of the things I loved about being in corporate America at that time was I had a lot of freedom to take care of myself in the way I needed to take care of myself, because I had a job where I could work from home or work somewhere else, and I could go swim or do what I needed to do. But when I traveled, it was very difficult, so I had to kind of balance that a little bit. So accommodations were interesting, and I would say this is where architectural barriers became more of an issue. So that's probably where my interest in architectural related stuff came to be. And then this is when I worked for Project Hired, which was not too long ago. Project Hired, I worked again with people with disabilities, but I was their HR director. So I was helping people that were facilitating others to get jobs, helping them make sure that people had accommodations, that laws were followed, blah, blah, blah. So that was a really wonderful environment, and that a lot of, maybe 75% of the employees at Project Hired have a disability of some sort, whether it's a physical disability or any other kind of disability. And so it was an environment much like this has been today, where there are a lot of people here who have disabilities, and there's a little bit more of a comfort level. There isn't some of the stigma that sometimes happens when you're not in that kind of environment. So those are my experiences. That's kind of where I come from. And I wanted you to have that background for some of the other things that we're going to talk about today. And before I move on, I just want to see if anybody has any questions about anything. All right. Well, you're still awake. That's good. So let me tell you a little bit about my world. And I share this with you not so that you feel sorry for me or anything like that, because I'm really not interested in that. It's really more about this is just what it's like, you know, just because. And the stuff you couldn't ask me anyway, so you might as well get it without having to ask, right? Time is a big deal. In my world, time is like a big, big thing. And I am always budgeting my time all the time, because things take me longer to do physically. And so we all have the same amount of time, and how we use it depends on how we use it. Fortunately, I don't have kids, because I think I would probably never ever get out of the house if I did, because it takes me so long just to get myself ready. But just so you have a sense, getting ready for me in my day, it takes me an hour and a half. That doesn't include eating, and it doesn't include getting anywhere. That's just from the time I get up and take a shower till the time I'm dressed. It's an hour and a half. I try to shave time off the time all the time, and it never works. It's an hour and a half. And one of the reasons why it takes so long is because I have swelling in my legs, and in order to not have a stroke, which I really am not interested in, I need to wear compression stockings. And so they take a really long time to get on, because I can't bend a certain way. So I have all these weird devices. If you came in my house and looked at the device I use to get on my compression stocking, you'd be like, wow, what is that thing? But it's pretty wild looking. But it just takes time. So that's one big deal. That's a huge thing. So when you think about that, and you think about like an early morning meeting, those are hard for me. I can make it happen, but it's hard because I'm going to have to get up at 4 or some crazy time. So when you map that onto like an accommodation for somebody, think about that. Sometimes we think of accommodation as like this big hairy thing. It might just be making a meeting happen and a half an hour later for someone, right? I mean, that's not hard to do. Taking care of myself. So today, I traveled by train to get here. I live in the South Bay. And then I motored over, because I like the outdoors, and I motored over on my scooter. It goes pretty fast, and I was clipping people off as I came up. Yeah, I am kind of a crazy driver. Nobody's lost a limb, so we're still good. But I don't drink a lot on a day like today, because I'm not sure how soon I'm going to be able to get to a bathroom. And if the breaks are short, and everybody and the bathroom situation's limited, and I need a bigger stall, and everybody goes to the bigger stall, because why wouldn't you go to the bigger stall? I don't really have any criticism about it. I like the bigger stall too. I mean, it's just, they all should be that way. But I'm not going to get to go to the bathroom. So, you know, that's just the reality. So when you think about, map that onto like a meeting that you might have, where you give people a 5-minute break to go to the bathroom, and I'm in your meeting, I know I'm not going to go because I won't get back. So that's something that I definitely think about. And so that means I don't drink a lot, and I might not sleep as much because I know it's going to take me longer to get ready. So just, FYI, I'm not somebody that needs a lot of sleep. Thank goodness. That would be a problem. Travel. So I mentioned that I traveled. So travel for me is first on, last off. So I'm the first one on the plane and then the last one off the plane, and I have to check a bag because I can't manage my bag. It's just too hard. So when I traveled every week for 7 years, I was the first one on, the last one off, and I had to pick up a bag at baggage claim. And every now and then, I used a manual chair for a while. Every now and then, my chair would come back looking a little weird. So I'd have a wheel that was now square, and I would have to deal with that for the time that I was doing whatever I was doing wherever I was, because I was only there for 2 or 3 days, and there wasn't anything anybody could do. So travel is a big deal, and yet I love to travel, and I would not have it any other way. I'm going to travel, and I don't know anything different. It's not like I know anything else, so this is just my experience. But it was really great when I wasn't into it. Usually the day after I traveled, I didn't have to go into the office, and that was really helpful because I needed time to just regroup. I was exhausted. So that's just something to think about when you're thinking about people with certain situations where they might need some sort of accommodations. I'm mentioning all these things to you from an accommodation standpoint. That doesn't cost anything. I still got my work done. I just didn't do it in the office that day. It doesn't want to move. So now we get to accommodations, cost of accommodations. So fact or myth? What is it? It's a myth. And what is it really?
Excuse.
What?
Excuse.
It's an excuse. Yeah, that's actually a great answer. Yeah, most of the time it probably is.
Willful ignorance.
Yeah, and it's probably discomfort. I know there was mentioned something earlier today about I don't know who said it because there's a lot that's been said, but about somebody talking with a recruiter about somebody who I think was hard of hearing or deaf, and the recruiter being like not calling them back. I think there's a discomfort and there's a fear about having an interactive dialogue that's really missing, and unfortunate that it's that way, because that's what makes the difference, is the interactive dialogue to come up with solutions. The solutions I shared with you for my situations don't necessarily work for everybody. I'm speaking only as myself as an individual. When I'm talking about my experiences, I can't say how it is for other people. I have no idea. I'm not in their body. So really, most accommodations don't cost very much. So one of the things is, how do you make one? So what are reasonable accommodations? What are they? When you think of reasonable accommodation, I don't mean necessarily an accommodation itself, but what makes it reasonable? Making a reasonable accommodation really starts to level the playing field so that somebody who's qualified for the job actually has the opportunity to contribute their skills and talents, and that's what we want people to be able to do. It's really what we want people to be able to do. So what makes them reasonable? Let's just look at a couple things. So one thing that's really important is that accommodations are provided to people who are qualified to do the job. We're not talking about providing qualifications for somebody or accommodations for somebody who's not qualified. That's a big distinction to make, and I think a really, really important one. Obviously, if it's a smaller employer, and I know there was a person earlier today, one of the people on the panel, I think who's left, talked about accommodations being easier in a larger company, because you don't have, if it's something that's expensive to do, it's a lot easier for them to not have an undue hardship that comes their way. Also, it's really the employee or the candidate's responsibility to ask for an accommodation. Doesn't mean that you can't engage in a conversation, but if I need an accommodation, I need to speak up, because how are you going to know that? You're not going to know. It's not your responsibility to figure out necessarily what I need if I don't give you any indication that I need something. So it's really on the onus of me, I think, to start that dialogue to happen. And this is probably the most important piece. It's an interactive process. I don't always know the right answer. You don't always know the right answer. The person, and if it's somebody in your workplace that you're working with that's an employee with a disability or a candidate with a disability, definitely you want to talk to them about what they think the accommodations should be, but that may not be the only accommodation that's available. There may be 3 different ways to solve the accommodation issue. And they've come up with one, and that one causes undue hardship, but the other 2 don't, and they might just work just as well. So you gotta interact. I don't have all the answers on accommodations, and neither does anybody else. That's why the interactive process is so important. Here's some accommodation resources, and a lot of them have been talked about earlier today, but the best place to start is with the person that's requesting the accommodation. That's the very best place to start. Because if they're a seasoned professional or they've been in the workplace for a while, they're probably going to know what they need to do. And then Human Resources is a really great place to go. Disability affinity groups may have some resources that they can tell you about. The Job Accommodation Network we've already talked about today, that's a really great place. I mean, that to me, I've gone there many, many times to solve accommodation issues. And then the EEOC, there's a lot of information there too as well. So I just want to touch on essential job functions really quickly, and then we're going to break into groups and do some accommodation exercises. So there are functions of a job that you need to be able to do, and then there are functions that are kind of off to the side. So accommodations, making an accommodation for somebody is accommodating for the pieces that they have to be able to do all the time. So as an example, if somebody is supposed, their job is to drive a UPS truck and deliver packages, they need to be able to get out of the van and deliver the packages. As long as they can do that, that's great, with or without an accommodation. You may not know, as somebody whose body functions perfectly, that somebody who, has a prosthetic leg or is missing an arm or whatever can do that, but if they can do it, then they are qualified to do the job. So you really have to think beyond what you think somebody can do based on your own experience, and think of what somebody would be able to do just because they've figured out how to do it. I actually know somebody who delivers packages and has one arm, so it's possible. So this is another example. When I was working for Project Hired, there were a lot of call center operators that work in call centers for VA hospitals in the area, and this is one of the things that's on a job description that we had used there. So it tells what somebody needs to be able to do. Now, if they can do this with or without an accommodation, they meet the qualifications for being able to perform the job. All right, well, I know I'm going to have to wrap it up here. We could probably go on for a long time. I thank you for engaging in the conversation around accommodation. I'm going to give you a few parting thoughts. So, make your workplace accessibility friendly. That's like the biggest piece. Biggest takeaway for me. And we've talked about some of the ways to do that. So have a clear process for requesting accommodations, and make sure everybody knows what it is, so that all the way through the organization, people know what they need to do, from the recruiters on to the managers, everybody. Oftentimes, recruiters are the people that touch the candidates first. I was a recruiter early in my career. If an issue came up around accessibility, I would need to know what to do. So don't leave them in the lurch where they don't know what to do because they may not do the right thing because they don't know what the right thing is. Create job descriptions that clearly indicate what somebody needs to be able to do the job. Provide disability etiquette training. I believe you mentioned something about providing a booklet. There's training out there. It's usually pretty fun and pretty funny and very educational. Highly recommend disability etiquette training. I've led some in my life, and I love it. It's really, really fun. And then, of course, my architectural bent. Design office spaces with accessibility in mind and incorporate universal design. So real quick, I was working somewhere where they just renovated a building, and they made all the trash cans step cans, so I couldn't throw away my trash without lifting the lid. They made all of the electrical outlets by the seating on the floor, so I couldn't reach them. They were up against a wall. This is really basic stuff. Specifically, I noticed the mobility, physical architectural situations because that's what I live with. It's a lot cheaper to do that stuff on the front end than to have to retrofit it on the back end. And it was all retrofitted, but I had to bring it to somebody's attention. So that's just easy to not have to do. And then be an advocate. Support other people who are, really looking for support with accommodations. You may see something that somebody else doesn't. You may have a point of view. If you're in the know, make sure you share that and help people get what they need. Thank you very much for your time.